Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. I'm joined today by my good friend Stephen Erikson. Hello,
Hello,
Steve.
how are you?
I am doing very well. I hear you've had a busy week,
It has been Friday interview, Saturday interview, and now today. So
and you've been signing books in Munro's
yeah,
books. So
yeah,
people who had ordered from Munro's, the God is Not Willing signed copies have now been made available.
yeah. Apparently, yes, yeah,
So that's exciting.
yeah. It was good.
But
It was good.
I thought today we could talk about characters and agency. And
Oh yes,
the
agency.
re- the reason I bring this up, someone had raised a really interesting point in the comment section about certain characters having agency, certain characters not having agency. And what my initial response to all of this, because of, being a reader and a critic is, and studying narrative is, no character actually has any agency because
No,
they are constructs. They are
they are.
narrative constructs. They are narrative tools. There is no agency. They, no matter how well realized they don't have agency because they are a tool the author uses within a narrative.
Yeah, the only agency that exists in a book is the authors.
Um,
That's what it comes down to.
but this is a very and while we were talking, because we talked about this very briefly before we started recording,
hmm,
and it's, while that is true in one sense, it's a more complicated picture than that, because yes, that is the, yeah, no character has actual agency, but that's not really what people think about when they think about characters with agency. They're thinking about the simulation of agency. They're thinking about the representation of agency that a character might have, the illusion of agency, which is obviously different to agency itself, which
yeah,
obviously, in an absolute sense, a character cannot have.
no. And the other side of things, from the author's point of view, is if a reader has taken on a character, and if a character can be a grand total of 3,000 words in a book, or less or more, whatever. If a reader has taken those collections of words and the name attributed to it so far inside their own narrative landscape, which is what's being recreated when you're reading, you recreate it in your head, then the author has done a good job. And so that side of things is it's the conceit is precisely that is what the author is trying to achieve through these characters. Otherwise you would not be able to trigger emotional response in the reader, right?
So it's basically an illusion we fool ourselves with when
Yeah,
we read that,
yeah,
because as soon as you become aware of the artifice of narrative, which obviously you as an author are aware of the artifice, you create it. Me, when I'm doing analysis, I'm aware of the artificial nature of narrative when I'm tearing it into little tiny pieces and poking it with a stick.
yeah.
But obviously, when we both are readers, when we're just reading, we buy into that suspension of disbelief, that willingness to give yourself over to it and be carried along and join in on the illusion.
I mean, I'd like to, and it's one of the things when I'm teaching a workshop. The first thing I'm going to talk about to my students, or whatever you want to call them, is what I'm going to teach in that workshop regarding narrative structure could fuck up your reading for the rest of your life, because you cannot, in some respects, as much as I would like to immerse myself to that extent, there's always a part of my brain that's deconstructing how these things were done. And so it's all learning process, and that gets in the way of just being, pulled along a narrative and having a blast with the narrative. I mean, it happens, but very, very rarely. And usually for me, it needs to be outside the genre. It needs to be written in a style that I couldn't hope to match. And I'll still steal stuff from it. I'll steal the stuff that works.
No,
But
I
that's
think the artistic term is use it in an homage.
oh yeah, whatever. Yeah. it is the learning process. And so, you know, in a workshop, um, the writer is going to learn how to read, in a sense, in a different way than they read before.
Yeah.
And that can have a huge impact on their favorite books. It can really mess things up. So I sort of come out with an early warning, that if you're going to go in this direction, it could mess things up for you in terms of your just basic enjoyment of reading fiction.
Yeah, and that is something that I've noticed. It's also one of the reasons why people hate watching films with you and I,
Yeah.
because we both do this.
Yeah.
But it is something I've noticed. A lot of the books that I read when I was younger, or read before I started a lot of the study into this, I look at now and I can't unsee
Yeah.
a lot of these things.
Yeah. You can't go back. There is no going back. Once once the bones are sort of revealed and you're able to identify them in written text, you cannot go back. There's
And
no way
as
to do it.
a crass way and a very blunt way of expressing that is ignorance is bliss. If you don't know how it all works, then it's never going to bother you. But the more you know about the structures of it, about the different techniques, it can reveal things.
Mhm.
And in certain texts, in certain narratives, where beforehand you wouldn't have noticed these things and it would have all been fine, now you see them and you go, oh, that act, I might have a bit of a problem with that one.
Yeah, and it's the equivalent of you know, the audience listening to this conversation. If you've been a student and you're asked to read books, and you're asked to read, it doesn't matter if it's a textbook or whatever, you study those books. That's what you do as it's par for the course. I'm stuck in that mode, and I think writers are stuck in that mode for the rest of their lives. When they read, they are studying as well as everything else. They can be caught up, you know, I've read many histories and I'm caught up in the histories, and I'm caught up in the story being told, but I'm also studying as I go. And there's you can't stop it. It's there.
But I will say a positive aspect of that at least I've found, is I've found a much greater appreciation for texts that wouldn't have appealed to me. That now, because I can see the beauty of how it was put together, I can see how cleverly something was done.
Yeah.
I'm understanding it in a different way. I'm enjoying it in a different way. So even if I'm reading a book, a 19th century romance that is, you know, not really the sort of thing that appeals to my narrative soul, I can be reading it and just be really invested in how technically wonderful it is,
Yeah.
even if the story is not the one that ordinarily I'd be invested in, because I'm not a 19th century noblewoman looking for a husband.
You're not?
I,
Okay.
not this weekend, no.
Well, the ponytail kind of confused me. So.
You do one thing for charity,
Uh,
and no one ever lets it go. But we were meant to be talking about agency,
yes.
and in particular, the point that had come up was Chalice. And I think there's interesting points to be made about Chalice, the character in Gardens of the Moon. But we could talk about a couple of the characters in Gardens of the Moon in different ways to discuss this. And I think Chalice is a fascinating example of this, because it's going to discuss Chalice, we have to understand that Chalice is viewed very much from another character's perspective. A young, adolescent, idiotic, stupid young boy who projects an entire image and story and narrative onto who Chalice is. And it's this very interesting trick that you pull of having an illustration of that externalization of a narrative, projecting a narrative onto someone where their internal life and their internal construction and their own world is actually radically different.
Yeah, it's kind of a microcosm of the whole process of somebody reading, even reading a book or meeting somebody for the first time or whatever. There's a lot of projection going on, and most of that projection, well, some of that projection can be guided by the narrative, details of the narrative, settings, characters, their physical features, their gestures, all that kind of stuff. But a whole lot is out of control. It's not within the realm of control of the narrator, of the storyteller. So it's kind of an example of that. And we were talking about earlier about this idea of projecting a complete sense of a character based on a certain number of words on a page that allows him to build a person out of a character. Well, that's exactly what Crocus is doing. And it's entirely self-serving on his part, but all of it is actually a setup for a completely different thing, which is to invert the boy gets girl trope at the end of the book. So it's kind of it's a punchline, and that's certainly how Chalice is set up in this novel. And it was only until Toll the Hounds that I did realize that no, we need to go back to Chalice and see where her choices, and she had agency, where her choices took her. So,
because that moment at the fete at the end of Gardens of the Moon, where Crocus pulls her outside, basically abducts her, because you could, and this is an interesting thing about narrative framing. From Crocus's point of view, he's the young suitor with the love of his life, and he's sneaking her outside to profess his love, and she's going to fall into his arms, and there's going to be a sunset, and there'll be stirring music in the background. From her point of view, she's just been abducted by a random stranger.
Yeah.
And it is seeing those two narratives collide, because she turns to him and is like, who the hell are you? And it's at that moment that Crocus's entire narrative construct, his entire projection onto her, where she was an object to him. She was the love interest who was going to fall in love with him because it was destined. Yeah. Suddenly collapses because she's a real person. She has her own life. She has her own things that she's doing, and it doesn't involve Crocus.
No, and we saw nothing of that, right? Because we got only Crocus's point of view on this whole setup. So it's entirely one-sided, and I mean that's one of the classic adolescent lessons that I think each of us has experienced at one point or another, and so
but an interesting thing, just sort of about that, is that idea of the projection of a narrative onto someone else happens repeatedly in Gardens of the Moon. It's one of the techniques and tricks that you play repeatedly through it. So initially, how Animander Rake is described is again that projection of the Mane of Chaos, the Dark Lord of Moonspawn. And you even have him situated in the battle way up high, like, so literalizing that difference in stature. He's on a flying mountain. Everything about it is building into this narrative that the Malazans are looking up at this powerful godlike figure. And then later on, he's in Baruch's chamber, having a bit of wine.
Yeah.
And suddenly we see how, when you see things from different perspectives, it shatters those various illusions, and you realize that it's always more complicated.
Yeah, and I mean that's the great thing about point of view, and just how powerful point of view is in terms of shaping the conceptions that the reader will have. It's all down to point of view. You can I don't know, you can be in a football stadium and you're looking across to one end of the stadium, and you can see a person who's like that big, and you ask yourself, well, what do I know about that person? Well, you can't know anything about that person. And so that's why Rake he's that big on a Moonspawn when you first see him. And yet we've got they built this entire mythos around this one character. And then, of course, once you set that up, then you want to dismantle that piece by piece as we get closer to the character.
But to get back to agency for a second, because it's a really interesting concept, because when we think of agency in this regard, so many of the characters are part of the military. And you go, how does agency function in a rigid hierarchical structure where they are given an order? And you go, well, where's their agency? Well, they could choose to disobey the order. And you go, well, how often do soldiers just choose not to obey orders? Or, you know, you have agency. You chose to go into work today. You go, well, yeah, because I wanted to eat. And if I don't go to work, they're not going to pay me and I want food. So there's a really interesting discussion about levels of agency. It's not whether they have it or don't have it, but there are all these various levels of agency on a almost like a spectrum of decision making. And you go, oh, well, they chose to be soldiers. That's their choice. Really, that's it. They get to make one choice, to be a soldier.
Apparently, but you don't know what was behind that choice. You don't know what the options were. So it may have been no choice at all, right? So, and that's where backstory can come in and sort of flip things on their heads. But I mean, the obvious exploration of agency is the possession of sorry. I mean, that's where agency is central to that character and to the squad's sort of recognition or realization of their view of her versus, you know, what exists and what even the reader knows a little bit more than the squad does. So it's all playing around with agency in some fashion or another.
And again, so that this is tying in points of both agency and perspective, because from the squad's point of view, Sorry is a young female, very scary assassin. And that's how, and they treat her as any other soldier, apart from the fact that she's really scary, and because she's a frightening assassin.
Yeah,
that's the thing that makes her.
Yeah, I would think gender is not even relevant to it. It's just this is a soldier who is so scary as an assassin, they will not, you know, relinquish the title of recruit in terms of allowing that person into their inner circle, if you will. So, yeah.
And even then, when we call her Sorry, we don't know her original name.
No.
Sorry is the name that she gets once Cotillion has possessed her, and then she chooses a new name when she gets her body back, and she chooses to be Apsalar. And it's a fascinating arc because it is mirrored in part, obviously, by the possession of Mamet. Where he gets possessed by Raist, and Raist crushes his soul, destroys who Mamet was. Whereas with Sorry, we see that the sacrifice of Riga protected Sorry's soul and mind and consciousness, and Sorry then re-inhabits the body. So there's a really interesting sort of narrative mirroring going on with these different events. And it, in fact, in terms of, well, I would even say that it's not, Sorry has agency because Sorry is Cotillion. Apsalar doesn't get agency until the end. Even though she's in the same body. I actually think an interesting point about character agency in it is where we have both Crocus and Ganos Paran being manipulated by gods. And they are moving around, they are doing things, but gods are directly stepping in to manipulate them, to nudge them. And that is denying them agency in those moments. So, but and in some cases, it's beneficial. Crocus sees the coin on the ground that he reaches down to pick up and avoids getting killed. And that was Opon removing Crocus's agency to directly manipulate events, but it saved his life. So there's a fascinating thing going on about the hierarchical structures in the military affecting free will and agency and discussions of those kind. We have different things going on about gods possessing people directly or indirectly affecting them. And it's playing with all of these different things that while it's related to agency, I actually think it's a more interesting way to look at it is in terms of power dynamics and power hierarchies.
Yeah. Yeah. And Paran, I mean, there's a moment that's all of this leads up to where, Paran shows up in the book and has agency removed fairly quickly, in terms of where he's going to go and where, what path he's going to take. And that leads to, him getting stabbed in the back, and he doesn't have the agency to pass through, Hood's gates. He's pulled back. And so, yeah, he is being manipulated from outside forces, all the way up. And probably if you go back further, his station as a noble also removed agency. So it just keeps going back. And then you get that moment when he asserts himself with regard to the hounds within the sword. And that's his moment of actually cutting himself loose, all of these external forces that are acting upon him. And of course, in subsequent books, for a while he's floundering because his entire existence has been guided in one fashion or another. And now suddenly he's cut loose.
Well,
He's going to deal with it.
And Ganos is an interesting example because, yeah, as you point out, he was a noble. He was meant to take over the noble house, and he went, "No, I'm turning my back on that. I'm joining the military so I can be my own man."
Yeah, right. What?
You know how the military functions? So he joins. He gets his commission, and then Lorne discovers him and goes, "Right, you now work for me. I'm going to do this thing. Go and do that." And so suddenly he's gone from where, as a noble, yes, there would have been expectations put upon him, ways to behave that he should have behaved, and these sorts of things. He was actually far freer than was within the military. But he goes into the military, and he's working away in a backwater, and then gets discovered by the adjunct, who goes, "Right, I'm now recruiting you and taking you out of that chain of command, and you're now going to do my bidding, my direct bidding." And then get as almost as a reward, but also as part of the investigation, he gets promoted to captain, which obviously everyone resents because he hasn't earned it. He hasn't done any of the things to deserve a captaincy, and that is one of the reasons why he gets stabbed.
Yeah. Well, and also bear in mind that Lorne is grooming Paran as her replacement, as adjunct, and that's there's a subtext there that I don't think any of us ever talked about or even thought about, but she selected him to replace her, but because he breaks his way free within the sword, that just goes by the wayside. That does not happen. But it turns out that his sister is the one who then replaces Lorne. So,
which I'm convinced you stole from Star Wars. There are two. There's a sister.
Oh, good grief! Yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. Yeah, Tavor is Princess Leia, quote unquote. Yeah.
But it's fascinating because I've always said that about Lorne and Paran, that the Robert Redford Brad Pitt film Spy Game, where he recruits Brad Pitt as a spy and basically is training him up to be his replacement. I'd always seen that, well, ever since I saw Spy Game, when I then looked at, not obviously I needed to see Spy Game first to have this thought. So not always. Once I'd seen Spy Game, I thought this was a very apt analogy because it explained that relationship quite well in my brain. Is that more accurate?
No, that was even more confusing, actually. Well, but I mean, Spy Game. From what I remember of it, it's your classic, dare I call it, trope of the son slaying the father, the mythological aspects of things. Not really trope, more archetypal, I guess.
But the way that Robert Redford sees in the young Brad Pitt soldier, right, he's actually good material. Transfer him here to Germany with no one who speaks English, then I will bump into him, I will recruit him, I will train him up, he will be loyal to me. We see so much of that classic, and it is a classic espionage technique thing that occurs in a lot of narratives. So when Lorne basically takes him Perrin away from the unit and says, right, you're now doing this, and separates him from that. So his only point of connection now is Lorne. And it's
Yeah.
that building loyalty to only one person.
And obviously I stole all that from Spy Game.
Yeah, which came out, I think, several years after you'd written the book. You are very good at that, Steve.
I
Looking
know,
into the future.
It's timeline issues, right? You're just confused. I'm sorry.
But once I'd seen that film, that made a lot of that relationship much clearer to me. Because it suddenly made a lot more sense because I'd seen it play out in long form of that very specific trope. Because I haven't read a huge amount of espionage fiction. So that wasn't one that I was as familiar with. But I think then the dinner scene then, which is obviously one of my favorite scenes from Gardens of the Moon, it's really interesting for this because we have Lorne, who acting for as the will of the Empress in a lot of ways, takes a moment for personal vengeance. Like she wants to take down Tattersail, and Dujek crushes that.
Yeah.
In that thing, and suddenly Lorne essentially has her agency removed.
Yeah.
But it's the weight of the Empire, the weight of Lysine's will, the military hierarchy, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and all of that crushes her. So she becomes almost dead inside. That she, okay, I'll just be a tool of the Empire.
Yeah, and it feels odd to even be talking about agency in the context of Gardens of the Moon or almost anything I wrote, because agency was not a thing back then, right? It was not a thing. It was not part of the lexicon of reviewing and reacting to books. I mean, there was no reacting to books, at least not on YouTube or anything else. Can't remember if there's a YouTube. No, there's no YouTube. So it becomes, it's as if in dealing with the question of agency now, I'm being asked to, and you are as well, but to apply this new hot topic in terms of critiques and reviews onto a book that was written, or published in 1999. It just feels strange that it's the evolution of language, I guess, the evolution of what are the hot button topics and subject matters, and that sort of the sudden new phraseology that exists. I kind of feel like that somehow. Sometimes people talk about agency, and I'm going, well, yeah, it's all there, but I never really thought in terms of agency.
But I think that we can actually tie this back to a lot of the evolution in writing from the 19th century through to the 20th century, and the evolution of psychological realism in characters and making characters more psychologically real. And agency is part of that discussion. So where we used to talk about well-realized characters or three-dimensional characters or well-developed characters, agency would have been included in that discussion and not separated out as its own distinct entity and qualification. It would have been, if a character was realistic or well realized, then that is part and parcel of what you meant, that they seemed like a real person. They had drive, they had ambition, they had their own desires, they had their own internal lives.
And as soon as you say well realized, that's not the author, that is the reader realized in the head, right? It's an internal thing on their part. And so it always feels weird to have that thrown back at the author, have that thrown back at me in terms of, well, that's a well-realized character. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I'm glad. I mean, I'm delighted that that character became that realized essence, in your internal landscape while you're reading the stuff. But for me, every character has to be well-realized.
And well, I think part of that, again, is this discussion. If you think of the classic example of the Three Musketeers, where D'Artagnan, his entire life, respect the king, Cardinal Richelieu, and Monsieur de Treville, goes into Paris, sitting in a tavern having a beer, and so, Cardinal Rishu's are evil. Aha! I will fight him. You're like,
What? Yeah.
left turn at the traffic lights on that one, and it's because the plot, the story, the narrative event needed him to go in that way to hook up with the Three Musketeers to become part of that. The narrative needed him to do that, so it was narrative driven and it wasn't psychologically real. Where when we move into the 20th century, the more dominant mode is no, the character needs a reason to go back on something that has apparently been a long held belief. They're not just going to turn their back on it at a whim on the word of a stranger they don't know, and with no backup to why.
And the 70s adaptation of The Three Musketeers did a much better job of that, the Michael York one, because he's pretty witless for the first half of the film, and it was really well done, really well done.
And of course, the Three Musketeers is quite relevant for any discussion of Gardens of the Moon, because that's a lot of the modeling that we have for that particular crew.
Absolutely.
Because you even see that the parallel with Lady Simtel as Milady de Winter. Those storylines from the Three Musketeers, but adapted and placed into the context of the Malazan setting. And
AP homage.
Oh, sorry, the homage to the Three Musketeers. But and this is what I find fascinating. It's sometimes, and I do this a lot as a critic, or when I'm doing academic analysis or anything of this sort of thing. You pick one thing and you pick it out, and you're looking at it in all these different ways. But the thing is, we always have to put it back.
Yeah.
And you have to then, I have to then look at it in the context to see how that thing fits with the rest of it. By all means, break it apart, take it out, look at it from all the different angles. But you still have to put it back in, because the point about Chalice and how she is represented in the text is so dependent on the point of view of the narration, which is Crocus. And if you've ignored the fact that Crocus is the one viewing her, then you're ignoring a lot of where the information is coming from in the narrative. Yeah. So and this is what I love about complex narrative. Everything is interrelated. Everything is tied in together. And so when we see that interplay, yes, we could take Chalice out and look at how Chalice is described. We can look at the direct quotations and go, oh, this is how Chalice is being described. But as soon as we remember that it's Crocus is viewing her, that adds in an additional element to the discussion of this, because it reveals stuff about Crocus's character. And then when we see the arc of both what happens to Chalice and what happens to Crocus, we can then see it in terms of theme and structure within the text, which adds another dimension to this, an intention or a reason why it was done that way. So
yeah, and I think if there's going to be, for me, the one takeaway from this discussion that your viewers should really focus on is what you just said there. By all means, take these things out and analyze them. Discuss agency if you want to discuss agency. Discuss, other aspects that are sort of hot button topics, but put them back. And I think that is the takeaway. Put them back, because then you're then seeing it in a broader context, and then you begin to see how it interrelates. And it's the same if I was teaching a workshop and I bring up something like exposition or dialogue or psychic distance or something along those lines, and I'll highlight what was done, and then literally, I guess, in a sense, push it all back in and say, well, this is the function it served, and this is why that function either leads the reader in the right direction or in the wrong direction in terms of critiquing a short story or something along those lines. And even the decision of whether it's the right direction or the wrong direction is entirely up to the author. I just offer it up there saying, if you take it this way, this is what it means to the reader, or at least to this reader, and may mean that to other readers. But if you take it the other way, it may mean this other thing. So you can choose, but explore it at the very least.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point about all of this as well, is an author can have an intention, an author can be trying to do these things, and quite often that is heavily signaled in a text. So like the example we're talking about with Chalice, because it is Crocus's point of view, that signals something. Whether or not
Oh,
we
good
choose,
grief. I mean, her name, for crying out loud. Could I be more obvious? It's like,
well, just
you
because
know,
she's the Holy Grail,
yeah, and is unreachable and unattainable and all. I mean, can you be more obvious? But
but
apparently, yes.
no, but this is the thing. It's learning to read that way and learning to pick these things up is heavily dependent on a number of different skills, but also sometimes, and I have done this so many times where I have misread something, and it's through discussions with other people that I've gone, oh, right, okay. But also sometimes authors signal things and we go, but you haven't succeeded in it. And
Hmm.
that's perfectly valid as well. And
Yeah,
it may be that they haven't succeeded personally for us, or it may be that they just have not succeeded at all, that they've something has gone wrong with their
yeah,
intention and how it has been realized on the page. Like
yeah.
it's complicated. It's generally rarely simple. And but that's what I love about narrative, the complexity of it. And we always think, because when we read stories we go, I really enjoyed that it's a simple thing to understand, but there are so many moving parts,
Yeah.
not least of which is the fact that authors are very accomplished liars
Aren't we just? Yes.
when you're given time to prepare in advance.
Exactly. That's most of the process of writing is actually not sitting down on in front of the laptop and typing away. It's concocting all the lies that you're going to tell. And so that takes a lot of work. And I do it all the time, and drives my wife crazy. So there you go.
Well, anyway, I think we've had a decent discussion about this. um so Steve, thank you very much for joining me.
That was fun.
And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.